Welcome to the first debate of the Druid Conference. I'm Paola Criscuolo. I'm at Imperial College Business School. And when I'm organizing this year's debate together with Eamon Salter and Kel Larsen, when Kelt and Eamon asked me to help them organize the debate, I immediately accepted because I think the debates are the highlights of the conference. They are the most memorable event at the conference, especially if you, like me, you never attended the Decadence Party. I'm sure the Decadence Party is a very close contender for the highlights of the conference, but because I never attended the party, for me, the debates are really the highlight of this conference. However, I have to say, I didn't know what I was getting myself into. You can't imagine what happens behind the scenes. And I want to thank the speakers, the panelists today for being so flexible and keeping up with all the changes that occurred in the last couple of weeks. I just want to mention that even the Spanish king tried to sabotage this year's debate, and this is no joke. The lab experiment debate was supposed to happen today, and we had to postpone it to tomorrow because Marco Giarratana, one of the panelists, had to inaugurate a building at his university in Madrid, and the king last minute changed his schedule. So as a result, Marco couldn't be here today, but he will come tomorrow. And then just a few days before the start of the conference, another panelist had a bike accident, so we had to replace him. So yes, very happy to be organizing this year's conference and to have a set of panelists with us and to see many of you. We have a fantastic set of speakers. In favor of the motion, we have Maureen McEvely from Gothenburg University. Again, in favor for the motion, we have Mercedes Delgado from Copenhagen Business School. And against the motion, we have a partnership from Utrecht University. We have Caetano Pena and Koen Franken, both of them from Utrecht University. Debates have been introduced Druid since 2005, and since then there have been several very interesting debates on topics which are core to our field of innovation, strategy, and entrepreneurship. And this debate is certainly of key importance for us as scholars, but also for policymakers and government. But I would say it's also important for all of us as citizens, living in a world where there are so many societal challenges that we struggle to address. The spirit of the debates is really to bring together a group of scholars that are very courageous to take on this challenge and ask them to put forward some provocative thoughts that make us think about what do we do as researchers, challenge the data that we use, the research questions that we ask ourselves, the theoretical frameworks that we use in our work. And in general, I think it's really an opportunity for us to think a bit harder of what we do as researchers. Without further ado, let's look at the motion for this debate. Let's try. So this debate is questioning the use of mission-oriented innovation policy, and this is the motion. The recent shift towards mission-oriented innovation policy away from more broad-based policies is misconceived and will lead to lower social and economic benefits. Okay? Before I give the word to the panelists, these are some of the rules of the game. So the way the debate is going to be organized, we are going to have an initial vote. I'm going to ask you in a minute to raise your hand. Then we're going to have the 12 minutes for Maureen to speak for the motion. Then we're going to give the word to Caetano to speak against the motion. then Mercedes will put forward her argument for the motion, and then finally Koen will speak against the motion, and then each panelist will have a chance to argue against or to rebut the arguments in favor and against the motion. And then we're going to take some questions from the audience, and we will again vote. We will see how you reacted to the arguments put forward by the panelists. So before we start, I really need to see who is for the motion. So please raise your hand if you are for the motion. Okay. Okay, who is against the motion? Oh my gosh. There is a lot of work to do. But, you know, you have a chance. It is not the first time that it happens that we start with a very, if you want, biased audience. And it's up to you to change their mind. So, Maureen, if you want to come.
So, we stand for this motion. And we actually put up at the front, you know, the Druid innovation community obviously should be, I guess I should say, since you weren't against it, you for it initially. And we realize that mission-oriented policy has been incredibly popular among policymakers. We know it's attractive to academics because there's many things we think we can add into this. And I'm sure that our opponents today are going to try to add and develop this concept that everyone should be for this, and they're going to keep adding things into it. But trying to increase the scope of what is mission-oriented policy in this way does not solve some of the fundamental problems, which is why we will argue again by the end you should obviously be for it. And we'll see what you guys vote there. We also know that Druid motions are often very difficult to comprehend. So as the first speaker for the motion, I'm going to go through the different concepts, and obviously they're the ones that are in red to help us out. We're all trained in this, right? Let me go over here. So, what does misconceived mean? And taking here, we took it from the Merriam-Webster library at the top, and then we've tried to apply it to this debate here. So on the one hand, we have misconceived meaning badly conceived or badly thought through, a confusing, misconceived plan. And so in this context, it's a confusing idea which starts with the top-down problem identification resembling the planned economy, and then it later tries to expand scope to include bottom-up elements of what is now called neo-Schumpeterian entrepreneurs. It's also seen as wrong or inaccurate, or to make an incorrect judgment, where Merriam-Webster calls it the misconceived notion that bats are birds. Whereas here, the misconceived notion is that politicians can be seen as expert decision makers about future innovation trajectories, and the politicians can choose the right stakeholders to make decisions if they're not doing them themselves, and they can choose the right missions. Another word that's in the motion is this one, a recent shift. And here I put, only if history didn't happen. The Manhattan Project, which I mean a lot of people associate with perhaps a negative view here, but at the same time, if we look at it, this is a mission-oriented policy which led to the atomic bomb. It's one of the most successful and well-known examples of mission-oriented policy. The military has a long history of doing mission-oriented policy, and we can see that mission-oriented policies do have a role in some context, but it's only one piece of a I can't even say that word, jigsaw puzzle of innovation policy. So it's good for some things, but not for other things. Oops. One of my PowerPoints disappeared. All right, we'll go. Oh, I know, it's in the wrong order. There we go. So what is a mission-oriented policy? No, sorry, I'm in the wrong order. So what we are arguing, if broke my own flow there, not a good, but anyway, so the innovation community we're arguing has embraced broad-based policy, which is also part of the motion. And we think about Vannevar Bush, who was part of the military in the World War II, he brought that back into science policy and said for science policy, We really need to believe in autonomy and the autonomy of science and in individuals. We need to think about talent. There's a lot of examples, not least the TIP, or the Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium, which we mean isn't the same thing as mission-oriented. And so what science, technology, and innovation policy needs is highly trained talent. It needs autonomy, multiple solutions, and true Knightian uncertainty in many ways. So we need to understand the basics of science, technology, and innovation processes. So it was correct that the next slide was about a recent definition of mission-oriented innovation policy. This is taken from Marion's policy report for the EU. The mission-oriented policies can be defined as systemic public policies that draw on frontier knowledge to obtain specific goals, or big science deployed to meet big problems. And then, of course, at the end, she says, using this, we can solve or address the numerous challenges that people face in their daily lives. And yet the picture, of course, is the moon, going back to Dick Nelson's old argument about the moon and the ghetto. And what Dick Nelson argued was that this type of mission-oriented policy is very relevant and useful for certain types of tasks, such as getting men to the moon, but it's not very relevant or not very appropriate for solving other types of social problems, like what was then called ghettos, or gang criminality, or les banlieues. But cleverly playing on Dick Nelson's ideas, Marouane now argues that this type of top-down policy can, in fact, solve these other societal challenges. Which leads me to this slide, that we're saying that the misconceived mission-oriented policy can lead to lower social and economic benefits in the long run. And we put unfortunately there because, I mean, honestly, who of us wants to be against solving the numerous challenges that people face in their daily lives? Which of us want to be against solving carbon issues and global warming? What we're saying is that those are still the big problems that a broad-based policy has to deal with, but that if we go too narrowly into which missions and ideas are being solved, we'll close down future alternatives. And that's why we see it's too much of a planned economy, too much idea there, and we need the alternative. In fact, we also put it in different languages, and we did include Portuguese and Dutch to help Katana and Koan get the point here. Here comes an example from the Nordics, which is often seen, and especially by us that live in the north of Europe, think is a leading green transformatory society. And so we still must ask, are Swedish politicians really the expert decision makers on sustainability? Do they pick the right winners and able to implement mission-oriented policy, excuse me, in a good way? We're taking the example of ethanol, which is in the slides is called E85, where lots of money, that's the nice graph here, this is actually the production of ethanol, E85, but you had lots and lots of public money, you had lots of private money going into it, and then this technology didn't work. Well, does it mean the government shouldn't invest in technologies? No, but you shouldn't focus too much on one pathway, which we mean is part of the heart of what mission-oriented policy is about. I'd also like to call your attention to the quote at the bottom that we've translated into English for those of you who perhaps don't speak Swedish, which could be quite a few in the room. And it says that the policy has stressed, first it was ethanol E85, and then it was diesel, and now it's batteries. And it illustrates this danger of seeing politicians as experts. Electrical cars, we all know this is where the elite of the world are talking about at the moment as a solution. Yet, perhaps we need to think of the trade-offs and problems and why we need multiple technologies ongoing. Electrical cars, they rely on batteries. Batteries require rare materials and mining. It requires on electricity per se, which is increasingly becoming expensive. If any of you read The Economist, this week is all about that. And don't forget that politicians decided that electrical vehicles are zero emission. It's something called tank-to-wheel policy. So in their standards, they do not include the emissions of the electricity that was generated in order to push the car. So if you do it with dirty coal, it doesn't matter, the electrical car is still zero. So it's just a little example of this. All right, I'm running on time. 2 last slides. What we're arguing then is in this broader-based policies, which could be called foundational innovation policies, it's close to what the TIP consortium is arguing, that there's really 3 parts of the policy, but there's many other supporting ones that is more important or would be very useful. So in our triangle in the middle, we put knowledge-intensive innovation ecosystems. We have sophisticated demand and regulation, and STEM, so science, technology, engineering and maths, as well as entrepreneurship skills is vital. And then there's a lot of words of other types of policy instruments that we mean are super important in order to understand and what policy should be doing instead of mission-oriented. Doesn't mean we're not solving the same problems. It means we're getting there in a different way. So finally, my last slide for this intervention is I just want to reiterate that we believe in broad-based policies as foundational innovation policy, and we urge you to avoid this misconceived mission-oriented policy. So what is it we're telling you not to do? Well, we're trying to encourage you not to narrow the search to these missions, not to reduce the options for the future, not to lose future technological and industrial pathways, not to increase the power to the bureaucrats, and not to hand over the power to special interests who are then trying to define what is public on this side. So what are we arguing instead? Well, we need to embrace resilience through creative destruction, foster innovation and entrepreneurship, promote resilient ecosystems, and invest in people with creative capabilities. And unfortunately, this side is where the neo comes in. We believe the other side is where the Schumpeterian part comes into it. And the reason, in fact, we started with obviously the innovation community and the Druid should support our motion, is if we go back to the homework of some of the classics. Perhaps not everyone in the room has read them, some of us have. Then we should be reading our Chris Freeman, Dick Nelson, Carlota Perez, Max Weber, Edith Penrose, or Mancure Olson, in order to understand more in depth why choosing from the top down leads to problems, and why trying to add in more and more stuff to this fundamental approach does not solve societal problem. Thank you.
So hi everyone. I hope that you are not convinced, but if you are, hold on, I will convince you otherwise to vote against the motion. And meanwhile, I can say that Carlota Perez favors a mission-oriented approach. She's a close friend of mine. And actually, according to her, we are in the second part of the technological revolution where we need the state to step in and to promote new directions for innovation efforts. So let me make my case against the motion, so it's always tricky, and for mission-oriented policies, or why you should vote against the motion. So first, let's do some definition here. What is new about this new generation? So I think a lot of the argument that Maureen said was about the old type of missions. We are talking today about new type of missions, about transformative missions, and there are 3 aspects to missions today. The first is directionality. Is a recognition that science, technology, and innovation has not only a rate, we always study, but also a direction. And it's about promoting new directions that provide further impact of the innovation through a focus on societal challenges, which is the second aspect. So instead of aiming at industrial catching up, which is also a type of mission, or technological feats, as putting a person on the moon, the new missions seek to mobilize knowledge, to create solutions to urgent and persistent challenges of our time. So missions also allow for mobilization and coordination of a whole of society approach. So it's not just a top-down exercise, it also mobilizes academia to inform about the possibilities of the solutions that can be developed, and trying to frame the mission not in terms of developing a pet preferred technology, but defining performance criteria and allowing for this bottom-up experimentation to happen. So mission can facilitate this coordination efforts through specific governance structures and collaboration, experimentation, learning, using not only supply-side instruments, but also demand-side instruments. So the first question you may ask, so are the new mission-oriented policies a copy of this old technocratic approach? The answer is no. They draw inspiration of them to create a new generation. And I won't go through all these categories, but on the left-hand side, there are the characteristics of the old type of missions, and on the right-hand side, the new type of missions. And the key aspects is that we are developing now technologies that are not insulated from civil society. They need to diffuse as well. So it's not just about landing on the moon. It is about developing technologies that will be used. So it's not just developing solar technology, but that solar technology will be substituting for the old fossil-intensive technologies. And so as you see, centralized control is a former type. We have a new type where it is more bottom-up, decentralized, where there is a role for the state to coordinate, but it's not a top-down approach. Then what do we know about? So the second part of the motion talks about lower social and economic benefits. What do we know about these technologies or about these mission-oriented policies from the past? We do have a track record of the impacts they created, and we draw inspiration of that, and we can refer to this track record to justify or to help us argue in favor of these new mission-oriented policies. So we could say from the same policies that brought you everything that you are using right now instead of paying attention to me, so will come also solutions to the societal problems of our time. So we have innovations from instant coffee, insect repellent, duct tape, aviation, Teflon, car safety technologies, including the airbag. The airbag is interesting because you have missile explosives in the airbag. It was developed to explode something and now it's saving lives. So the atom bomb is not the best metaphor. You could use these missile technologies to refer to the airbag. Internet, liquid crystal display, lithium-ion batteries, DRAM cache, and so on and so forth. And yesterday we learned that even the vaccines, the mRNA vaccines are also related to mission-oriented policies from DARPA. So we have a lot of evidence that good things that were created by the military reach our daily lives and are beneficial. So why not now focus on different problems, not only military problems? That's what we are arguing for. And these technologies evolved and created whole new sectors and firms around them that create lots of impacts and growth and new productivities and ultimately creating these new sectors. And okay, if we look at estimates of how many jobs are created by mission-oriented policies, the military ones, and we see there is one study that says that $1 billion in mission-oriented spending creates approximately 11,000 jobs. But this same estimate says if we direct this money to green technologies, for instance, to clean energy, that will be 17,000 jobs, or maybe to healthcare, 17 and 200,000. So we may redirect our priorities and create the new missions to reach further impact. Does it mean then that we will not have funding for blue sky research? No, not at all. That's not what we are advocating here. We can redirect existing mission-oriented military R&D funding to societal missions, and we see that there is lots of money going to military R&D, defense R&D. Not only, of course, the United States stands out, and including within this military defense budget, we do have health priorities. Health security is a big area of their defense concerns nowadays, but other countries as well. And we see in terms of participation to the GDP, also different countries appear to dedicate a lot of money. So how about redirecting this to other priorities, to climate change, to demographic change, to energy security, or other areas of civilian concern? The other question that we have is, how big is this impact in macroeconomic terms? So what can we tell from the past evidence in terms of mission-oriented R&D? Does it create a higher impact than diffusion-oriented R&D? investments, public investments? Does it lead to lower? So what very recent evidence is showing from papers from 2021 already published is that we do have a larger fiscal multiplier effect. So $1 invested in mission-oriented R&D has a higher fiscal multiplier than any other type of R&D investments by the government. And also, in terms of crowding in private investment, we see a positive, bigger impact. So what do they say? These two studies, one shows that on average across periods and countries, a 1% increase of mission-oriented R&D leads to an additional 0.485% public R&D, 0.705% private R&D, 0.485 for total factor productivity, and 0.56% GDP. We also show that years of positive gains, the sums of discounted net present values, and the average yearly gains to GDP ratio, mission-oriented R&D has high internal rates of return. Sizema, he studied not only the United States, not only military R&D, he also looked to environmental missions and other type of missions across European countries. So this is a result that is not just concerned to military R&D. The other study by Delady and Mazzucato, and they show that public investment spending generates a higher multiplier than public consumption spending. That's probably not surprising, but they also show that R&D spending generates a much higher GDP multiplier than investment. And mission-oriented innovation spending generates the largest super multiplier effect, around 10 times higher than the standard government spending, excluding R&D. Therefore, mission-oriented spending generates the highest private sector R&D multiplier as well. So the evidence shows that the second part of the motion is wrong. Mission-oriented policies generate higher economic benefits, and as I have shown, also higher social benefits. And how big is this? I'm going backwards, so going forward. My final slide is why do we need new mission-oriented policies? What further benefits can we achieve with this new generation of mission-oriented innovation policies? Well, for one, we can strengthen the link between public investment in science and technology and accrued societal outcomes. We are living a period of time where society is questioning the value of science, is questioning why do we need to invest in science. So the mission-oriented policies, they help show that there is a link between what we put in terms of money into science and the benefits that result from it. So that's I think, an important way to be accountable to society by investing in technologies and then in science technology and then showing, well, this, what you're using today, your mobile phone, your computer, this is the outcome of our investment, our initial investment. And here I don't want to dismiss the role of private initiative. No, the mission-oriented approach includes the participation of private actors, of entrepreneurs. We need the whole of the society participating. There needs to be legitimacy. Who here saw the First Man movie, where it tells the story of the first man to land on the moon, might remember that at some moment in time, there is protest for civilian rights, and people questioning, so why are we putting men on the space race instead of trying to solve the problem of the ghetto, as Nelson said? And it was when there was the questioning of the space race, that's when investments in the space race is starting to diminish. And therefore, establishing this link is key also for us to have an effective mission-oriented policy, because legitimacy is very, very important. Also, mission-oriented innovation policies create an incentive structure to mobilize diverse stakeholders, align interests, and pool resources towards addressing the grand societal challenges of our time. So, in my exposition here, I focus a lot on what we see from the past mission-oriented policies in terms of impact of R&D, military R&D. Koen will show more about the second part, about the grand societal challenges, and how can we use the mission-oriented to tackle them. But one important way is not to define them very narrowly in terms of technologies, but as a boundary object, as we are developing in a paper that we are presenting in this conference tomorrow. So it's a boundary object that others stakeholders can relate to and can thus contribute to as well. So there is an open flexibility in terms of defining the mission. And therefore, I finish by saying I recommend you all to vote against the motion and in favor of mission-oriented policies. So thank you very much.
Perfect. All right, so, and it's not counting yet. Kelly's been very good. Thank you. So, let me emphasize a very important point that Maureen was making. This is a misconceived innovation policy, the mission-oriented one. And why is that? A fundamental problem is detached from the innovation ecosystem, whether it's the national innovation ecosystem or the regional innovation ecosystem. And we know that those ecosystems are specialized. We also saw this morning in the keynote that innovation policy has the greatest effect when it takes into account context. This figure is from the work from Mazzucato, and you can see the misconceived part. We start with the Sustainable Development Goals. A few years ago, it was the Millennium Development Goals. And from there, the policymakers and experts are going to choose missions. And then later on, we are going to engage the citizens. But you see, there is nothing about innovation ecosystems. Indeed, we have found a few papers. We haven't made a careful literature review. But to motivate this point, that this mission-oriented innovation policy perhaps is going to induce us towards a mission drift. We're going to lose our personality, our DNA, the things that our regions know how to do very well. Another argument that we find in the literature is that in order for mission-oriented to work, guess what? It needs innovation ecosystems. And now they call them the sustainability innovation ecosystem. Sexy word, but we need the innovation ecosystem. That's the foundation. We also know from some recent work that when there is a natural disaster, corporations are actually very good in adapting, sensing the needs, being very agile, and respond to the shock. They're actually better than government agencies. So we then wanted to understand better as scholars, what do we think is the differences between the mission-oriented versus a broad-based innovation policy that we are going to call foundational innovation policy. The key is that they're asking two very different questions. Mission-oriented is asking, where is innovations to solve societal problems are? You see, we're already conditioning. In the broad-based innovation policies, the question is, where is innovation and good jobs in the economy happening? It's a much broader innovation question. And then how can we support those firms? In doing so, we're going to be exploring a broader set of problems, which is going to induce a broader set of solutions that could have a higher economic and social impact. Okay, so let's illustrate that. Here we have an anticipated societal challenge. And we have very good news because we're all here because we have solved this problem through foundational innovation policies, through messenger RNA platform technology. So the mission-oriented innovation policy is reactive. 5 years ago, did any one of you hear about pandemic mission? I didn't, right? It was very reactive. And when we had the problem in front of us, in 2020, suddenly we were in a mission. In contrast, the foundational innovation policy is proactive. More than 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, very young entrepreneurial firms were exploring a brand new, very risky technology, messenger RNA. And they were asking a very broad question. They wanted to solve a very broad problem. And by the way, that is in common with the DARPA policy, asking broad questions rather than a mission, narrow question. And the question that they were asking is, how can we deploy messenger RNA molecules to tackle life-threatening diseases? Any disease, cancer, heart, but also even how can we use it to crop production, agriculture? And here you have the sample of some of those firms. Moderna, Green Life for the crop production, BioNTech in the innovation ecosystem of Germany. So one of our key points is that in order for transformative innovation to happen, you need resilient innovation ecosystem. And that's the essence of broad innovation policy. It's in this ecosystem of the Boston region life science ecosystem where we see some of the first vaccines with messenger RNA. And how did that happen? So 20 years ago, back in 2000, there is this venture capital firm called Flagship Pioneering that decides that it's going to take a lot of risk and is going to invest on biotech inputs that are very risky. 10 years later, 2010, they decide that one of those risky projects biotech firms they wanted to invest on is Moderna. They are going to try to see how to use the messenger RNA. And very important, the only reason they invest on messenger RNA is because they're thinking of many applications, not one particular narrow mission-oriented application. In fact, the co-founder tell us, we went after everything. And not surprisingly, many of their firms went for cancer vaccines because there is a huge market for that, right? So that was the start. To do this, that leveraging the innovation ecosystem, in this case of Boston, access to specialized skills, STEM skills, for example, from MIT, access to one of the best scientists in the world in biotech, Bob Langer, from as well MIT, funding, suppliers, PPP policies, and so on. You see, foundational innovation policy. Then 20 years later, COVID hits. And then is when we are going to prioritize messenger RNA for one particular application, which is COVID vaccine. You see, we needed to start much broader. It's here, 20 years later, and then suddenly we start talking about mission-oriented. Let's put a lot of push funding, as Margaret Kall was very well illustrating, to rapidly solve this problem, try to help solve this problem. But we will not be here today at Druid Society in this debate without resilient innovation ecosystems that need these broad-based innovation policies. So let me go back to the question and find further evidence. Imagine we're asking, where are innovation and good jobs happening? So that's the key question. And based on some of my research, actually, one part of the economy that's creating a lot of good jobs with high wages, a 50% growth in jobs, are inputs, in particular service inputs, that are going to be sold to other businesses and the government. We call this the supply chain traded services. They're very STEM intensive. They are relying on data. They're creating new GPTs, general purpose technologies. And examples of these services are from fintech to enterprise software to cloud computing services. And they are creating a lot of impactful innovations, and they're creating good jobs that are going to sustain families. Because remember, in the motion, we care about societal and economic impact. There is a lot of evidence about this, not only from our research, recent work about competing in the age of AI and others. And many of these innovations are driven by entrepreneurs, like firms like Okta in cybersecurity, played to build the fintech infrastructure that we need to offer credit to small businesses. Solo.io, that last week became one of the unicorns for cloud computing services. Do you think these companies are impactful Are they going to have a large impact in society and in terms both of society and economic impact? And we think the answer is yes, just by looking at the data and the kind of innovation they're doing. So how do we support them? As Maureen was mentioning, we want to support them with this foundational innovation policy. Let me illustrate with two of them. The most foundational of all is support STEM skills and entrepreneurial skills. These service inputs are very STEM intensive, but we know that in many cities and in many countries, there is a shortage of STEM skills. Even if we have a shortage, we also are underutilizing the STEM human capital that we're training. We also know from research here in this group that female STEM talent is underutilized, even if we have a shortage. So if we really want to have a big impact to solve these pressing societal and economic problems, we need this broad-based innovation policy that through private-public partnerships are going to support training, hiring, retraining, retention of a very diverse STEM workforce. And this is also the essence of NIH. The essence of these foundational technological policies is support people versus projects. My final example, and I have 50 seconds, is that regions are the ones that know how to build back better. So it's not about these top experts, policymakers telling countries and regions how to make them resilient. The answer relies on the regions. Why? Because regions have different comparative advantage. Because of that, they have different needs. It's going to be very different to do a green transition if you are Denmark, highly specialized in clean technology, versus you are a region in Pennsylvania that is reliant on coal. And many of you know Ronnie, and if part of this community, he agreed with our motion. The best ideas are going to come from the local areas. Thank you.
Right. I kind of pick up where Caetano left us. And what are we actually talking about here? We're talking about unprecedented societal challenges that threaten the sheer existence of our planet. Mission-oriented innovation policies are about tackling these grand societal challenges. There's global warming, where most of the attention goes to, but there's also huge loss of biodiversity and increasing chemical pollution. And the last two receive very little attention, but maybe even harder to tackle in the future. Apart from these challenges, there are other challenges. Mental health issues, aging in Europe, obesity, an increasing dependence on technology platforms from China and the US. And in many European cities, my focus here is on Europe, we have an affordable housing crisis. And all these challenges are persistent. Many of them are known for decades, and very little progress has been made so far. And why is that? Societal challenges are wicked problems. They are uncertain because there are many complex cause-effect chains involved. They're also uncertain about what solutions may help. They are complex, involving many different actors and also different geographical skills. And they are contested. So society, voters, political parties do not agree on what are the most pressing problems and what can be the most promising solutions. Now, what I want to stress is that technological innovation here is not enough. And quite often, it's not even the bottleneck. Because for many of these problems, we have technological alternatives. We can cycle in the city, as here in Copenhagen. We have developed solar PV and wind turbines. But what is the problem is that we are not able to scale up these innovations and change the very institutions that make people embrace, accept these technologies. So what is needed is complementary changes in organizational innovations, new legislations, new regulations, stricter regulations, and also behavioral norms of consumers and citizens changing. Now back to the broad-based, old-style innovation policy. We have the market failure-based policies and system-based policies. And although they stem from very different intellectual traditions, they both are just supporting the supply side of the economy. And societal challenges require policies that steer innovation in a very particular direction, solving the hardest problems we face in society. Market failure and system failure policies also mainly support vested interests, because most of the subsidy schemes in Europe subsumed under these policies are for formal R&D undertaken by large firms that have sufficient profits to fund it on their own. And it mainly goes to innovations along well-defined technological trajectories that follow the capabilities of those firms. The additionality of these policies, as we know also from econometric evaluation studies, is pretty low. And that's also quite logical, because you're supporting the ones that are already occupying market power in their respective industries. Now, what we need for societal challenges are complete new coalitions involving civil society, involving local governments, involving social movements, and of course involving firms, but not necessarily the firms that were causing the problems in the first place. So we also need radical solutions, which not necessarily mean radical innovations. Another radical solution can be to stop doing things, to phase out certain technologies, and to have strict regulation on, for example, chemical compounds. And that is why we need mission-oriented innovation policy. And in fact, although we are debating it today, and we may disagree, it is already mainstream. If the OECD publishes a report on policy, it is mainstream. And the OECD defines it, in my view, in a very proper manner. They define mission-oriented innovation policy as a coordinated package of policy and regulatory measures tailored specifically to mobilize innovation, not only technological innovation, in order to address well-defined objectives related to a societal challenge and in a well-defined time frame. So it is about coordinating policies already out there. Policies not just of R&D, but also policy regarding pricing, policies regarding regulation, policies regarding behavioral change, etc. Now, the objective and time frame here is very important, because articulating a clear and well-defined objective that has broad support in society mobilizes the ideas, energies, times, and talents of many people, not just of firms. And it thereby reduces this very wickedness of societal challenges, because if a government can state a bold objective that is credible, a market is created. Expectations are aligned, and people can start investing in the long run. While if governments have not such policies, investments will not happen. The time frame is also very important, not just to express the urgency of these problems, but also to be able to measure progress on an annual basis. In that sense, it's very easy to evaluate a mission-oriented innovation policy, because you can just look at a few or even one key indicator and understand if you're on the right track or not. And this is actually what happened with the Paris Agreement, which in Europe was then translated into a binding target of a net domestic reduction of 55% in greenhouse gas emissions in the next 10 years compared to 1990. Unfortunately, we are not on the right track reaching that target, which only means we have to speed up and increase our efforts, including these mission-oriented innovation policies. To end, I want to take away, before we start discussing, some common misunderstandings about mission-oriented innovation policy. It is not about the man on the moon. It is not about big science for big problems, as some people called it a few years ago. It is a very new type of mission-oriented innovation policy that includes innovation and diffusion. In my view, diffusion is much more important here than innovation, because we can build on innovations already developed in the past. It is not just about involving producers, but also users. And it's not just about technology, but very much about regulation. You may say it lacks a theoretical rationale. Yes, market failure and system failure are policies built on decades of research in our community. But if you want a rationale for mission-oriented innovation policy, just go back to your Economics 101. It's all about reducing the negative externalities that we create on a global scale and providing quality public goods, rather than breaking down government even further. And talking to economists, you may get the argument, well, they just have to get the prices right. Internalize all those externalities in the right prices. But of course, we know prices are not decided by economists. They're the outcome of a political process. And lobbies prevent proper pricing of production and consumption with high externalities. And even if you would have such high taxes, it doesn't mean that automatically the market will switch to a complete new technological paradigm. As we know, there are vested interests and switching costs involved. Just think back to the oil crisis in the 70s, where there were massive increases in prices, but very little innovation coming out of the market, and no alternative for gasoline car at that time was developed. And finally, you may say, this is simply too difficult for governments to handle. Yes, mission-oriented innovation policy is a difficult policy, because it's about coordinating innovation policy, pricing, regulation, behavioral change, even geopolitics comes into the picture. But if we look back in history, governments have been very successful in solving societal problems from the past. We have abandoned slavery and child labor. We have solved the poor hygiene in the ghetto. We have been able to avoid flooding and, more recently, acid rain. So why think that today governments cannot tackle the societal problems, while in the past, with fewer resources, less knowledge, less urgency, they also were able to solve these problems? So, to conclude, mission-oriented innovation policies are not misguided. It is exactly what we need to solve the problems of our time. And if you agree, vote against the motion. Thank you.
So thank you, Koen. Very compelling. I'm very convinced, and I'm sorry, Maureen and Mercedes, you didn't convince me. Actually, you convinced me that we do have some tools of innovation policy that are now not targeting the problems that we have. So there is no reason why we can't use the foundational approach towards missions. So I think that you provided some good arguments for, okay, let's use those tools that we have and focus them on missions. Why not? And also, you raise the question, where are innovation and good jobs happening? Well, guess what? They are happening around the technologies or in the sectors that emerged where missions were developed in the past. So in these ICT areas, in AI, in biotech, and so on and so forth. So it's another argument. The high-quality jobs are precisely those that are emerging in the mission areas of the past. And I think another argument to give was the mRNA. Yes, that's a story we will be disputing here. Who is the mother of the baby? Is it the approach that they're defending? Are the missions? Well, let me just tell a bit more of the story. So I had to look at my mobile because those names, those acronyms from DARPA, they launched in 2011 the ADAPT Protect, Autonomous Diagnostics to Enable Prevention and Therapeutics, Prophylactic Options to Environmental and Contagious Threats. And in this project, they found the research by Moderna in 2013 that led to the development of the mRNA treatment. So I think that we see, again, repetition of the story, that we see some mission-oriented research resulting in innovations that nowadays we benefit from. The question also that I would like to raise to you is, why aren't corporations commercializing the innovations that help us decrease emissions, help with mental health, help with the neglected diseases? Why aren't we seeing policies that combat malaria? And here I'm not talking about treatments, I'm talking about also other types of policies that could lead to the innovations that treat malaria in Africa. In the Middle Ages, we had malaria in Europe, so I think that we do know how to eradicate malaria, but it's not happening. And my point is that we don't have a whole of society effort to achieve those goals, those missions. And that's what we need. We advocate this working together. So to sum up, I think you misrepresented the type of missions that we are defending here. It's not state versus private initiative or governments against society. It's all of us together towards a common goal. And these mission-oriented policies, they can help establish this common goal. So again, vote against the motion. Thank you.
Right. When I started, I said up front there was a huge hype about this, and that Caetano and Koen would try to increase mission-oriented into actually supporting broad-based innovation policies, or what we called foundational innovation policies. And in fact, you conceded our point well. Moreover, Koen said that one of the most known definitions of mission-oriented policy, Marianne's from 2018, is not relevant anymore because that's no longer mission-oriented. So there's a bit of confusion here, let's put it specifically, that's a difficulty in talking about these missions, and it comes back in a lot of the examples we've heard today. We've heard lots of examples of how mission-oriented in the past helped out society, but these were military technologies. What does military do? They have lots and lots and lots of money. And one thing we haven't heard today is about where the money will be coming from for these mission-oriented. How are you going to organize these things? So I think that's something I'm sure Koen's going to come back. I see that little twinkle in his eye over there. But still, at the end of the day, who's going to decide about these missions and how we're solving it? Mancur Olson taught us that even in the most democratic processes, there's always a tendency towards special interest taking over and getting their problem solved and not someone else's problem solved. Society has a lot of different problems. To me, a lot of this sounds like what politicians should be doing, perhaps, rather than what, well, we'll put it that there's a lot of, the thing about policy, and I think that's what's really missing here, is you have to make trade-offs. And that's what our ethanol, diesel, electricity example showed us, that you can decide that electrical cars have no emissions, but it's not going to solve all the problems we need. Second point, Koen gave us a really emotional talk that this is the only way to solve the future problems, and of course we all want to. We want to make a better society. I'm really glad to hear that through this type of policy we've solved the problems of the ghetto and the banlieue. I don't quite see that in my local environment in Sweden, but great, that'll work. On more seriously on this, there is actually no empirical evidence and very little evaluation of the mission-oriented policies. Are they actually giving us alternatives? Are they solving any of these problems? And we had this nice claim, well, we can take military R&D and put to missions, and that sounds very attractive. It's probably a better use for a lot of this. And by the way, we heard that it won't affect basic research or blue sky research. But I don't know about your National Scientific Foundation. It is having effects already today. They are already moving out. Final word, we argue for talents, individuals, autonomy, and of course this is a public-private partnership. That's the only way society works, but we don't want this top down. Thank you.
On the definition, I use a definition that's empirically grounded rather than ideologically grounded, and OECD reflects what's going on in practice. On politicians, the politicians are not deciding on the technologies here. They're deciding, together with civil society, on the articulation of the objectives. And that is how it should be in a democratic society. We should not leave it up to shareholders to decide how our technology is evolving in the future. On the financing, good point. I would say let's finance subsidy with tax. So let's start taxing large companies that evade taxes, mainly via my own country, the Netherlands. And OECD, again, is making work of this. We can also do without the patent box, which exempts firms from paying taxes over profits that are resulting from patents. Again, Netherlands has a very generous patent box. And I think most of the R&D subsidies we can do away with. Why? Most R&D subsidies are for innovations that are new to the firm. But what we need is subsidy for innovation new to the market. So I think I have the budget there. Yes, innovation systems are important, or innovation ecosystems, if you want to use that term, but they are functioning, they are there, and they can mostly organize themselves through alliances and public-private partnerships. Clusters, you advocate clusters, you advocate smart specialization, you advocate specific policies for specific regions. Isn't that a form of directionality? Aren't you then making choices for certain industries over others? And finally, I totally agree that regions, and not so much nation states or Europe, should be deciding on what challenges they want to tackle and with what innovations they want to do. That's completely in line with the subsidiarity principle of the European Union, and probably it's not so different in the US. And that's why I would advocate for decentralizing mission-oriented innovation policy to preserve the variety of solutions and to make sure citizens in each region can co-develop the innovations they want. I leave it at this. I give you 20 seconds.
So for the rebuttal, I am going to use one slide because I want to end with a very optimistic message. That's how much I believe in the foundational innovation policies. So let me, perfect. 2 slides. So what we propose is let's foster resilience through creative destruction. Very Schumpeterian, right? We don't call it the neo-Schumpeterian. It's just Schumpeterian. And let me give you the good news. There are many impact firms. Just here on the Nordics, thousands, okay, impact firms. They are not waiting for us to tell them what are the grand challenges that they need to solve. They're already here, they're already having an impact, they're already driving change. They are operating in many industries, across industries. Many of them are going to be these very STEM-intensive services that are powered by data and new general-purpose technologies, cloud computing, AI, and others. They are born in specialized innovation ecosystems. So if we really want to have a large societal and economic impact, we need to help these young firms that are in each of your cities, in each of your countries, to scale up. And in order to scale up, we need these broad-based innovation policies to have a large impact in the economy. And with this very optimistic view, I just want to say thank you for this very interesting debate.
Okay, so before we tested the ability of Mercedes and Maureen to have changed your mind, I'm going to take some questions from the audience for the panelists. Valentina, we have a student.
Thank you for a very interesting debate. So I have a question for the against side. So this is maybe a bit inward looking, but we're a university here, right? So I want your view on the mission-oriented policy trickling down to funding, for example, for science. So the Danish government has decided to earmark a large part of its budget for independent research to green transition. We all agree that we need something to address climate change, sustainability, but what if our research solves other challenges? Why do we know that green transition is more important than antibiotic resistance or not having a new antibiotic for 30 years? Or the crisis of migrants from refugee camps? So when these missions become so pervasive that actually they start blocking also basic science, are we pushing it too far? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think that the people asking should state I'm against the motion, I'm in favor of the motion before asking. No, I'm joking. No, I think that it's not a zero-sum game. There is no reason why all the money should go to the green mission in detriment of other missions. There is, I think, enough money, especially in a rich country like Denmark, but I wouldn't say just that. But if you adopt, as Koen has said, taxing those who don't pay tax, there is a source of money. You don't even need to go so far as to accept modern money theory to say that there is money. But there is no reason why you should not have money to fund other missions. I actually would like to raise to you the question, is this the only money that Denmark is giving to science, or is there other sources as well? So what's the issue with having a green mission? Does it mean that the other research is not being financed because of that? And what evidence is there to show that there is a crowding out, so to say, because of this funding? So to sum up, I think it's not a zero-sum game here.
Maureen,
Koen would like to compliment?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a question about being for or against the emotion, although perhaps you've interpreted it that way, because you did say that you didn't think that the mission-oriented would be crowding out other times. The issue is that in the Nordics, it is actually more and more. You know, it is being earmarked for this. It is being earmarked for certain issues, and these trade-offs or other types is a real issue. And it also means, that's also why we were arguing for autonomy of science, for individuals, for believing in talent to solve a number of different problems, both today's and the futures. Which is why in our slides we had this as a small piece of the puzzle. It is important for certain types of things, but when it becomes the one or the only, it becomes too dominant, then it does cause problems because there are trade-offs, because we will close future options. And we choose one trajectory, which is what we tried to show you with the ethanol, and not other ones, and then go to the next one. So I think it's a really important issue that, goes beyond this debate. But that's also why, we support several of the Druid keynotes the last couple of days that talked about science takes a long time to be novel. We don't know what's going to be relevant. These types of basic ideas is affecting people's research careers today.
Koen, do you want to?
Yeah, I would like to stress that there is no opposition between basic research and use orientation. That's the famous Pasteur's quadrant. So most of the scientific breakthroughs were motivated by social or military problems. And given the urgency and the commitments that national governments have put on meeting the Paris target, I think it's only logical that part of the money is now reallocated to those areas of research which can still be fundamental, that will help us to meet those targets.
Mercedes, do you want to add anything?
What I will add is that I actually like to be humble because there are many problems that we cannot anticipate. And that's why it's so important that we suddenly prevent other broader research to happen. Because as I mentioned earlier, 5 years from now, are you thinking about a pandemic challenge or mission? So I think we need to be humble about how even climate change can manifest in so many different ways that still we don't comprehend. So that will be my answer to that fantastic question, Valentina.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
I have a question.
Carl. Yes.
Thank you. So I have a question which I guess is mostly to Cayetano and Maureen, but anyone can take it. And there were some very interesting slides here. I'm particularly interested in these examples of multiplier effects from R&D spendings to military efforts. I mean, these are by and large now the most evidence we have for these mission-oriented policies, but none of the missions that we highlighted or that we would want to see are military defense projects, right? So to what extent this, I guess, is an external validity issue, can we generalize from those investments? Also, please remark that DARPA did not, fund or initiate mRNA. That was the work of a female Hungarian scientist.
Thank you.
So thank you for the question. So I think that it's not about adopting the same model of the military missions and applying it to societal issues. It's about understanding and learning with these past examples and using them as a governance model of new innovation policies that seek to tackle societal challenges. And one thing, it's clear, it's not about selecting narrowly defined technologies as the silver bullet to the challenges, but defining broad areas and yes, earmarking funds to those areas that are agreed and are legitimate to the whole of society. So it should be not something that comes from the mindset of politicians, but something that is agreed and legitimate to civil society. So the key challenges of each society.
Thank you.
Yeah, since you asked it to both of us, I do think there is a real issue about this with validity, empirical evidence. What do we know today, going forward? And Koen said, well, from the Paris agreements, we got some KPIs there. We haven't met them yet, but we know where we're headed. Yes, in some ways, and in other ways, I think all researchers think, well, key performance indicators are important for some things, but then you don't see something else. And that need to have a diversity of ideas, diversity of pathways that are kept open in this matters. And at the moment, this thing about the lack of empirical evidence that mission-oriented policies in the non-technological areas would actually impact is worrying, because there is lots of money going into these policies, that's first. And second of all, even in these military technologies, evidence that's coming up, we have lots of companies. We have lots of entrepreneurs, lots of large companies, lots of ecosystems working on these things. So it's not like it started. And I think there's an important issue about what we were talking about with talent, autonomy, multiple pathways. We still need to keep these open. Otherwise, we will reduce our future options quite quickly.
Thank you. Koen?
I would like to stress that you are not doing mission-oriented innovation policy to generate spillovers. That's an additional benefit, but that doesn't really matter. the legitimacy of those policies is that you want to solve that problem, regardless of whether there's any spillover. So in that sense, even if it has 0 spillovers, you could still want to solve climate change because of obvious reasons. Yeah? And for that matter, the multiplier of R&D subsidies is very, very low. So also in that sense, the broad-based policies have an even bigger problem of validity than the mission-oriented policies, perhaps.
Thank you. Brian?
So, thanks, this has been great. This came up a little bit, but I just want to push a little more on it, and it's around choosing the right missions, I guess, because, and to lay my cards on the table, I can imagine one person's mission is another person's, boondoggle. And so, Koen, you raised this issue about today, the vested interests getting in the way of stuff, and I didn't quite understand how that's going to change. So I'm going to put it in terms of theory. Like, we know a lot from political economy, we know a lot from research on non-market strategy, we know a lot from research on regulatory capture. What from that should give us confidence that missions won't be captured? That when it comes to doling out the money, which I guess is where the rubber hits the road, that won't be captured?
That's definitely a big problem. So even if you articulate societal missions, you will immediately have a call from big industry that claim they can solve it. So I think those missions should not start from the innovation system in place. It should start from the organizations that have articulated those missions in the first place. These are citizens' movements, local governments, environmental NGOs. They have both the legitimacy and the knowledge about the problem, and very often also about the solutions, because they also collaborate with scientists. So I would indeed call for programs that do not start with big industry, but start with other innovation actors that also have been very successful in tackling problems in the past.
Thank you. Maureen?
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue. I mean, Koen is interpreting it as being vested interest equals large companies. And political economy, as you said, has shown, well, democratic processes can also be co-opted by special interest. Someone wants this problem solved and not that problem solved. And I think it is a key issue. I mean, of course we like the idea that there are problems that the NGOs and local people can be involved in, but I think one has to be quite aware that you'll be solving this problem and not that problem, or there are these trade-offs, and there's a long political economy history of the problems that arise then and misuse of resources. So I do think it's a really important topic. And just to say that vested interest could be anyone who wants their own problem solved and not someone else. It doesn't get solved just because a lot of different people are in the mix. Someone's still deciding whose voice is heard, whose solutions or problems are being heard.
We have time for a last question.
Well, may I
Maybe
compliment?
if we go this side of the room, or do you already have the microphone? Excellent.
Hi. I wanted to come back to the problem of basic research. You said that the innovation must come from other actors that have that know the problem and somehow know something about the solution. But if you look at history, most solutions come from topics that have nothing to do with the original problem. For example, when Fourier made his mathematical framework, he didn't thought that we could use it to encode audio. Also, the telephone was made to listen to orchestra, to opera, not to communicate. So how do you know that the problem of the problem to climate change wouldn't come from another area altogether? And for the one in favor of mission-oriented, is it a problem that maybe firms aim for short-term profits? I mean, Tesla is a clear counterexample of that, but maybe you can think that green-friendly mobile costs more in terms of, so they are harder to sell.
I just want to stress that I think most of the societal challenges that are now being articulated do not lack solutions. So we know what causes obesity, and we also know how to prevent it. Yeah? We have solar PV and wind turbine based on very old science and technology, and we know that is the way to go. So I don't think science and technology is the bottleneck in solving societal challenges, but it is the diffusion and the further learning by doing, societal acceptance, societal embedding, that requires coordinated policies that combines innovation and diffusion policies with other policies.
Mercedes?
I think we are in a moment in today's economy where we have these huge waves of new general purpose technologies. CRISPR, messenger RNA, cloud computing services, AI, and of course the firms are ahead, and ahead of the government in terms of the innovations they're making in this space. But what is a key barrier that we have? STEM education. Educate the people so that we can continue using those tools to have societal impact. And we see that many of the startups are having a sustainability impact, like for example in logistics, the last mile to make it less emissions. They're using these tools and they need more people with these STEM skills. So that's where my answer will be to your question.
Thank you very much. I think we're ready to vote again for the motion. So again, this is the motion. The recent shift towards mission-oriented innovation policy away from more broad-based policies is misconceived and will lead to lower social and economic benefit. So I ask those for the motion to raise their hand. And those against the motion. Wow, this is a very good work that Maureen and Mercedes. Excellent. I promised you it was going to be an engaged debate, and it has been, so thank you very much for coming up. Tomorrow there is the other debate that Kelt is going to chair on lab experiments. I'm sure it's going to be as exciting as this one. Thank you very much. Bye.